Welcome to Breaking the Set. I'm Abby Martin. Here in the U.S., the general view of the Cuban economy is that every single industry, from restaurants to taxi services, are controlled by the state. And for years, that was mostly true. But with stagnant economic growth, the country has begun to institute significant reforms, handing more and more control of businesses to private entrepreneurs. So today, we'll take a look at why Cuba has integrated free market elements into its socialist model and how their isolation has sparked an organics revolution in the country. So stay tuned because it's time to break the set. One of the benefits to come out of the embargo against Cuba has been creative improvisation, specifically food production. See, for several decades after the revolution, Cuba's economy was entirely dependent on its relationship with the Soviet Union. And when it collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost 80% of its trade and 63% of its food imports overnight, along with its ability to import petrochemicals. Meaning that the organic movement in Cuba did not grow out of altruistic environmental or health reasons, but rather out of necessity. Sociologist at UC Berkeley, Lauren Enriquez, told the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, "What happened in Cuba was remarkable. Other countries in the region took the neoliberal option and exported what they were good at and imported food. The Cubans went for food security, and part of that was prioritizing small farmers. And the result was an organic renaissance." Today, the country's agricultural system is one based on local, self-reliant organic farming. Urban farms, known as organoponicos, cover up to 87,000 acres of savanna and supply citizens with 90% of their produce. By 2000, the average daily caloric intake of Cubans was back up to what it was during the height of the country's dependence on the Soviet Union, proving that a local approach to food could be effective. While in Cuba, we talked to several vendors at a farmer's market about where they grow their crops and how they're distributed. And we were surprised to learn that the organic movement doesn't just apply to fruits and vegetables. In Cuba, the idea of pumping animals full of hormones is laughable. In fact, when I asked a Cuban butcher if he fed his animals growth hormones in order to make them bigger, he literally laughed in my face.
More meat? More meat? Look, the bigger the animal, the harder is the meat. If the animal is smaller, the meat is more delicious.
In conjunction with organoponicos, Cuba also has a massive food rationing program that has provided citizens with basic groceries for less than $2 a month. The rationing book, known as La Libreta, provides Cubans with basics such as 7 pounds of rice, 4 pounds of sugar, 10 ounces of beans, and 5 eggs per person per month. However, these rations clearly do not last an entire month, meaning that the subsidy system has to be reformed, considering average Cubans have to spend a substantial amount of their salary on food. Nonetheless, the percentage of Cuba's population that is undernourished is only around 3%. On par with rates in developed countries. But no matter what changes are to come, Cuba has already shown that it can adapt to new models while maintaining its self-reliance. Business cooperatives have existed in Cuba since the first years following the revolution. But last year marked a historic first for Cuban co-ops as the government moved to transition hundreds of state-owned businesses to a cooperative model in order to shed a bloated government payroll that's leading to much of the country's economic hardships. The idea is a simple one. Let workers take control of their own companies, share the profits, and make their own decisions without overbearing government regulations. And in 2014, at least 450 state businesses were converted into co-ops. Chief among these have been agricultural co-ops, which produce organic produce for local communities and restaurants. And today, these collectives are responsible for an estimated 70% of the country's farmed land. So in order to get a sense of how these cooperatives actually work, we visited one in eastern Havana, run by founder Miguel Angel Salcines Lopez. Miguel, how does the embargo affect Cuba's agriculture?
Well, in general, the embargo affects almost all aspects of consumption and raw materials that take part in food production. Think of seeds, think of equipment, tractors, seeders, and combined harvesters.
How are decisions made here, and how does the payment structure work?
Well, this cooperative, as with most co-ops, is a group of people who come together to start a business, and we choose a president by direct and secret vote. The president then picks a board of administration which works as if it was a small country. For example, there is an executive power, legislative power, and judicial power, which is based on the laws of the cooperative and the country. In terms of payment, there is a salary that is more like an advance according to one's level in the co-op. Whether you're a worker, group chief, department chief, and even the president has different salary. However, the distribution of utilities is done amongst us, and through personal initiative we distribute it in bonds. Therefore, people that first come into the cooperative receive a first bond, and according to their contribution towards utilities for the development of the business, they will gradually receive a greater contribution in the cooperative.
So where do you sell the food, and how many people can this farm feed?
This community has about 30,000 people. 80% of our harvests are sold within the community, and the rest of our production goes to restaurants and hotels, and even some businesses that need foods that we produce. Considering the latest changes in the country, it's very likely that our production will expand. There are many opportunities to sell produce with better prices and better economic assurances.
How do you guys combat insects without the use of pesticides?
Well, fortunately, nowadays there is a technology in the world capable of completely displacing chemical products. There's a myth that states chemical products increase results and that you can't have agricultural production without the use of those chemicals, which is a lie. We have a series of resources that have permitted us to do so, to not use any type of chemicals or pesticides. There's a lot of information from the US, England, Australia, Spain, Mexico, Colombia, where there are lots of people developing very effective methods to only produce organic. I might add that Cuba has 14 farming research institutions dedicated to testing and developing new technologies free of chemicals and pesticides to perfect the method.
Miguel, what do you think the United States can learn from Cuba's agricultural system?
Look, I'm certain that these past 25 years working on organic agriculture in a way out of necessity due to the limitations imposed by the embargo has developed a team of technicians and specialists which have proven to be a strength, not only on the Western Hemisphere but all around the world. We have specialized training on this matter. We have participated in summits, important events, masters and doctorate programs, and I'm certain that along with the knowledge of Cuban and American farmers, this could become a formula for success. We could combine both Cuban and American knowledge.
Thank you so much, Miguel. There's no doubt that Cuba remains a deeply socialist country. But over the last decade, the state has implemented economic reforms meant to open up certain industries to capitalist philosophies. In fact, since Raul Castro took power, the number of employees joining Cuba's private sector has increased to over 1 million in 2012, the last year for which figures are fully available. The majority of these employees belong to the farming sector, as the government has encouraged local food growth and a decreased reliance on expensive food imports. And privatization of the restaurant industry has gone hand in hand with the new reforms. So in order to find out what challenges face private business owners in Cuba, I sat down with Ernesto Blanco, owner of La Fontana restaurant in Havana. Ernesto, what's the process of opening a private business here in Cuba?
At this time, you can open up a business. You'll need to go to government institutions and complete everything. It's like an entire process that includes following the law, property inspection, sanitation inspection, and paying taxes. Right now, there's the possibility of opening up a business like this, so long as you follow the law.
And what kind of government restrictions exist for private enterprise?
First, there's the surveying and inspection of the property. When you are requesting, asking for your property to be surveyed, they come and inspect your property for construction and safety hazards. Then comes the public health inspectors, and you have to meet all their requirements. And then comes the process of hiring personnel, workers, and followed by a medical checkup for workers. The government makes its authorization, and then you can start.
Well, how do you compete with so many government-owned businesses, especially when you can't advertise?
In terms of promotion, basically it's word of mouth. We also use the internet as a resource. Right now we can promote on certain types of publications that exist in the country, but basically the best way to promote our business is through our customers' opinions and how we promote on the internet.
And how are workers' rights guaranteed under this model?
At this time, this is a very new thing that's growing in the country. For example, 3 years ago, we couldn't have hired workers. We could only have family members work for us. Today, at this very moment, we have 29 workers we've hired legally. The government demands that we pay our workers above the average salary based on where they live. At this business, I have to pay, I'm required to pay, above the average salary of this municipality, and I have to pay their social security.
How much more do you have to pay than government-owned businesses?
More or less, I'm paying 20 to 30% more than the required salary.
Ernesto, what changes would you like to see in Cuba's economic model as it stands?
Cuba is a country that's going through a transformation. Yes, I would like an economy that's more open, in the sense that right now we face many obstacles. For example, we, restaurant business owners, don't have a marketplace where we can purchase our foods, produce wholesale.
Where do you buy goods now?
Now there's another option for purchasing food products. We buy them directly from private produce owners because it's better quality. For us, the raw food materials are the most important part of the restaurant. So we have to find the best quality of food. The best quality food is sold by private produce owners. In other words, when we go buy farm and garden products, we go to specific private owners where we know we'll get the best quality products. When I talked about not having access to a wholesale marketplace, I'm talking about that at the moment we're buying our products at retail price. In other words, there are no wholesale prices for a commercial business owners who has to pay taxes. I've been in meetings in which the state government has talked about this issue, and the state has said it's because of the country's current economic situation. And as soon as the government's economic situation improves, it will establish these types of wholesale markets. The explanation from the state is that they have to guarantee the wholesale market serves the population. That's what they've explained to us.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me, Ernesto. Coming up, I'll sit down with Cuba's former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Stay tuned.
I'm a fighter. I can take a punch. I live. I learn something every day. I strike when I need to strike. I prepare. I've earned everything I have. If I fall, I get back up. I won't be underestimated. I'm Aaron Eid, and I put the boom into boom bust.
You know that guy who wishes someone would spy on him? How about the woman who enjoys being lied to by her government? This citizen can't get enough congressional inaction, and this taxpayer wants the mainstream media to be more corporatized. While this person would rather eat genetically modified food, this one thinks our prisons are not crowded enough. And what do these people have in common? They don't exist.
For decades, Ricardo Alarcón was Cuba's third most powerful figure. For 30 years, he acted as Cuba's ambassador to the United Nations, followed by a short stint as the country's Minister of Foreign Affairs. And from 1993 to 2013, he served as the president of the People's National Assembly of Power. Ricardo's now retired from office, but while in Havana, I had the chance to sit down with him to discuss Cuba's most pressing political issues and what normalized relations with the U.S. means for the country. Ricardo, why do you think socialism is the best economic system for Cuba?
Cuba has succeeded in the resisting and overcoming the longest economic aggression. The so-called embargo, we refer to it as the blockade, that have lasted more than 50 years. But Cuba has the best results in terms of education, healthcare, child mortality, and all that. Why? Because we had our own brand of socialism, which meaning a society in which the government has to be responsible for the welfare of their citizens, and the citizenry should cooperate and work together to improve their life. That for us is what the essential of socialism, and we think that we succeeded. It's not perfect, of course. We have a lot of problems and limitations, but don't forget that we could not develop that kind of a society freely without foreign interference, without foreign pressure. On the contrary, as President Correa once said, and he has repeated the same idea, Cuba may have problems, but before making any critical judgment about the Cuban results, you must end the economic blockade, because what Cuba has done has been under completely unique, unfavorable conditions.
What conditions have allowed the normalization process to even begin?
Someday, historians will try to explain how and why a policy that didn't function since the beginning, that was not effective since the beginning, was maintained for more than half a century. That's, I think that it was Einstein who gave that as the definition of madness, to keep doing the same thing, expecting to have different results. That madness, it was a mad policy. But I think that it was very, very important, the Latin American solidarity. The U.S. realized that it was in their interest to abandon that failed and mad policy, because it was demanded unanimously, time and again, by all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. 50 years ago, remember that when they began trying to kill or to defeat the Cuban Revolution, the first step was to isolate Cuba in the Western Hemisphere. And they managed to have, with the exception of Mexico, everybody else joining the U.S. in the anti-Cuban stand. Now it's the reverse. As Secretary Kerry recognized, we tried to isolate Cuba, and we ended being isolated in the Western Hemisphere because of our Cuban policy.
And why is Guantanamo Bay such an important piece of land to the Cuban government?
When the United States was in the process of expanding its territorial domain throughout North America. Then they wanted to control the Caribbean. They needed to build a canal through Panama to communicate the East Coast and the West Coast. And they, in order to protect that canal, they needed military bases around. That's why they control Puerto Rico and retake it as a colony until now. And they have there a number of military bases and also Guantanamo. Practically, the bases that they used to have in Puerto Rico had been dismantled because the U.S. Is constantly debating, the U.S. Congress, the reduction or elimination of foreign military bases that are not useful. And some politicians complain because they wanted to have a military base in the continental United States because that is a source of jobs and economic activities and so on. Guantanamo is the only base that doesn't produce a job for an American, that doesn't help the American economy. Quite the contrary, because it's an artificial outpost, not welcome by Cuba, without any facility on our side, and it costs entirely. They are wasting their money there. For what purpose? To protect the old Navy lands of the turn of the century, from the 19th century to the 20th century. It's a relic of an old imperial policy that everybody talk about the treason, the tortures, all that is, of course, is something that should be denounced. But more than that, they should close the prison, but after that, immediately they should also put an end to the occupation of part of Cuban territory and for a completely useless purpose.
Ricardo, in America, we're told that Cuba has very little access to the internet, very little free speech. What is your response to those claims?
Cuba has been presented, the Cuban government, as the cause of the Cuban people not having good access. They have, but not having good, efficient access to internet. But now, President Obama finally recognized that the U.S. had been the source of Cuba's difficulties in this area. And now he promised to end that policy. That policy that was reflected, as I said in the meeting, in the Helms-Burton Act, who gave specific treatment to denying Cuba to high-tech communication equipment and so on and so forth. Now, some Americans discover that it was not true. It was not the Cuban government, but the American government who was depriving those possibilities to the Cuban people.
What are the biggest obstacles that you see in terms of the normalization process moving forward?
The most fundamental thing is to try to advance in a direction that would be needed, not just for U.S.-Cuba relations, but for the U.S. relations with the entire world, is to abandon the pretense of hegemony, of domination, of being above everybody else and being superior. That's a real source of concern, not just for Cubans, for the future of mankind. We have to reach the day when Americans finally discover that God didn't give them any special providence to punish the bad guy, the bad child, and to direct the world as if it were a mission, a God-given mission. That's a very dangerous attitude that has been essentially at the background of their anti-Cuban policy, but continues to be at the background of their international policy as a whole.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me. It was a great pleasure to talk to you. During the 8 days my team and I spent on the streets of Cuba, we opened our eyes to the good and bad about the country's government and quality of life. It became quickly apparent that only the worst aspects of Cuban society have been filtered to us in the West. We're told that Cuba is an insulated totalitarian state with little freedoms. And although there is only one party, I don't know if America's two-party dictatorship and billion-dollar elections are much better. Cuba is one of the safest countries in the Americas as well. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the country has the third lowest homicide rate in the Western Hemisphere. And such a low crime rate isn't surprising, considering that people have their basic food, shelter, and healthcare needs met. As someone who's lived in Latin America, perhaps the most stark contrast between Cuba and many other countries in the region is the lack of homelessness and abject poverty. Nearly everyone has basic shelter, although many of the buildings are dilapidated. According to Cuba's National Housing Institute, 39% of the country's residences are in poor or inadequate condition, and there's not enough housing in cities like Havana. But still, there are few evictions or vacancies, unlike here in America, where there are 5 times as many empty homes as homeless people, according to Amnesty International. There's also no corporate chains eviscerating local culture or incessant advertising telling you how to be more attractive. Yes, it's easy to sit back and criticize Cuba for its ration system, its internet restrictions, and state media. But it's extremely important to understand that many of these shortcomings didn't happen in a vacuum. It's been economically crippled and purposefully stunted by the most powerful country in the world, kept under constant threat of regime change for far too many decades. Right now, Cuba is far from perfect, but it doesn't claim to be. Its incorporation of different economic models shows the government's willingness to change. The world can learn from that humility. But what Cuba has accomplished with the little resources it does have is astounding. Its ideology of internationalism sees human beings as one family, and that helping the world's most vulnerable doesn't need to stop at borders and nation states. The revolution wasn't an event. It was a process of transformation that's still ongoing. And until Cuba's allowed to evolve without foreign subversion and become a full member of the global community, that process can never truly come to fruition.